Today we're talking about light. And light is the key component for everything that we do in photography. Not only do we use our exposure to capture the amount of light that we want to have, but we can utilize light to make our image look the way we want it to look. So we're going to really talk about direction and quality of natural light today. And we're talking about natural light because we're not using any artificial lighting. This is a beginning class, and what we're using is the sun to expose our images. But these qualities and direction of light you can utilize with artificial lighting as well. We're just focusing in on natural light in this class. So we have the direction of the light. The direction of the light helps create shape and length of shadows. So the lower the sun is, the longer the shadows. The higher the sun is, the shorter the shadows. So early morning, late afternoon, long drawn out shadows. Midday, very small shadows directly underneath our subject. We can use this direction of light to emphasize or minimize texture and volume, right? So if the light comes from the side, we're really going to show off that there's sort of this volume, texture, and shape, that this element is taking up space and is a three-dimensional object. But if we use frontal lighting, which is light coming from directly behind the camera, we're going to minimize all of that shape, texture, and volume. We're going to flatten the image out. We're going to make it look much flatter. There's reasons to do both of these, and it's kind of up to you to decide. I would say try out in different scenarios both types of light and see what one you kind of like. The next thing we're going to talk about is quality of light, which is really the degree of diffusion of the light. So the sun is a hard source light or a direct light. If we were to move the sun super close to the earth, and we'll have to sort of suspend the idea that we'd all burst into flames, but the sun is much larger than the earth, and so if we moved it closer, it would fill the sky completely, and it would then become a diffuse source. So that same direct light source, when moved closer to us, the subject, can become a diffuse source because it becomes larger in relationship to the subject or object that we're photographing. And so what we do as photographers is we find things to put between the sun and our subject in order to make it larger in relationship to our subject and therefore diffuse our light. So the sun itself is a direct light source, non-diffused point light source that hits our subject all from the same direction and casts a hard edge shadow. Since we can't move the sun closer, let's say there's clouds in the sky. The clouds get lit by the sun, and then they become the light source, and they are the sky, and they're much larger. And they scatter that sun's light. Light travels in straight lines. And so instead of all those lines coming from a direct point source in the sky, they're coming from every direction in the clouds. And therefore, they cast multiple shadows that overlap and create a shadow, a singular looking shadow, with soft edges to it. And that is diffused light. And if it's fully diffused light, then the shadow will be minimal or non-existent. But directional diffused light will have some direction to it. There'll be a highlight and a shadow side to our subject, and we'll have this soft edge shadow. So let's review that. Direct light, hard edge shadows, specular parallel rays of light, all striking the subject from one direction. Creates a hard edge shadow, creates a distinct graphic look to it. Can emphasize shape, form, texture, volume, all of that stuff. For portraits, this is a portrait taken during the war, the Spanish War in 1951. And W. Eugene Smith used hard light to really kind of emphasize the harsh conditions and the things that go on in a time of war. It's not the most flattering light for portraits. It makes people squint. It brings out all the texture in their skin. It shows any issues or imperfections that show up. But it can be used very, very pointedly to make our image look a little bit harder and a little bit more harsh. This is Edward Weston's sand dune shots. Edward Weston is a California photographer who loved sort of straight photography and to have everything in focus and kind of capture what he saw and utilize light in order to really create this depth, dimension, and texture. And so you can see that we're looking at sort of top back light. It's striking the sand dunes, coming from behind them towards the camera, which gives us these big, beautiful shadows and all of that texture in the sand. And the shadows have a hard, quick transition from dark to light. So it is direct light, not diffused light. So I'm going to lump these two together, diffused and directional diffused light. So diffused light is scattered light hitting an object from multiple directions. And I won't even say multiple directions, I'll say from every direction. We call it omnidirectional light. And it creates no shadows or very little shadows, if any. And this will flatten and minimize texture, right? This will get rid of texture. It'll sort of smooth everything out, which is what makes it really good for portraits because, well, skin. And people like to have their skin sort of smoothed out when they have their portrait taken. Directional diffused light is partially direct with diffused rays. So it's coming from a direction, but it has diffused rays, which will give it shadows with soft edges. The shadows have a smooth gradation from dark to light. So here is a diffused light. There are shadows in this, the fronts of the steps, down in that corner of the steps, but the shadows don't really tell us a direction of the light. The shadows just sort of show us that there are different faces that we're looking at, different planes that we see within the image. Here is a very diffused light, slightly, ever so slightly directional, kind of coming from the left and moving towards the right, but very, very diffused. In other words, we have almost no shadows to this. And then here's directionally diffused. This is definitely coming from a direction. There's a highlight and a shadow side to our subject, and that shadow has a soft transition from highlight to shadow. Here's another one with directionally diffused light. We can see that there are definite shadows from our object and a definite direction to the light coming from the right, moving to the left. But the shadows have a soft edge quality, just a soft edge quality. So this is not extremely diffused light. It is just diffused light, like barely diffused light. The other type of light we're going to talk about real quick is backlight. And backlight is, well, it's sort of direct light hitting behind our subject, which creates a diffused light situation on the side that we're photographing. But it's a very high contrast light because the background is super bright and the subject is super dark. And the light comes from directly behind the subject. Another thing about backlight is do not include the light source in your shot. You need the light source to be outside of the frame that you're photographing so that you can better capture the image. So this is what a backlit portrait looks like. The background is slightly blown out. There are trees that are also backlit and they're not as blown out. But our subject has detail. In other words, we've exposed for our subject's face. We've used our exposure to make sure that the subject's face shows up. But we have allowed the background to go super bright. If we would have exposed for the background, then our subject would have been a silhouette, a pure black area that we wouldn't have seen any detail in. Here's another more extreme example of backlit. So they're probably standing in front of a window and we've exposed for their faces, which has blown out the background completely. There's no detail back there. In fact, it's so bright that it's starting to sort of wrap around them and cause a little bit of flare and kind of fading out the edges of the top of their head. So like, where does the baby's head end and the background begin? This is a classic example of backlit. Very, very bright, blown out background, detail in our subjects, and enough of a line around them so that they're not completely flared out. And then here's another backlit portrait. This is a self-portrait in a mirror in a window of a shop. And again, we have that light kind of coming from the back. And you can see that there's a little bit of a brightness along her shoulders and around her neck. And that's because the light is kind of, well, it's kind of coming from behind her to the left, but it's basically a backlit portrait. So that's our quality and direction of light and how we can kind of utilize that, or some of the ways that we can kind of see that. And we're going to use this to do our portrait assignment. So you'll see in our portrait assignment, we're going to be photographing direct light, diffused light, and backlight. And you'll need to capture all three of those. So look at the assignment for more details on that.